Erwin Rommel stood at his command post in Tunisia on February 14th, 1943, studying maps that showed him trapped between two Allied armies with his back against the sea. To the east, Montgomery's British 8th Army was grinding forward after chasing him across 2,000 miles of North African desert. To the west, fresh American forces were building up in strength, learning the terrain, preparing to squeeze him in a vice that would crush the Afrika Korps. Any rational assessment of his situation said he was finished, that North Africa was lost, that the only question was whether his forces would be evacuated or destroyed. But Rommel had not built his legendary reputation through rational acceptance of defeat. He looked at those same maps and saw not encirclement but opportunity. The Americans were green, scattered and overconfident. Their line was thin and their commanders were untested. If he struck fast and hard, he could smash through the American positions, capture their supply dumps, perhaps even reach the coast and trap British forces before they could link up with the Americans. It was audacious, probably impossible, and exactly the kind of operation that had made Rommel's name. In the next 5 days, he would launch an attack that would shatter American forces, send an entire army reeling backward in defeat, and deliver his final moment of battlefield genius before the Afrika Korps was ground into oblivion. This is the story of Kasserine Pass seen through the eyes of the man who orchestrated it, Rommel's last victory. To understand what Rommel saw in February 1943, you need to understand what had brought him to Tunisia and why he believed one more audacious strike could change everything. Rommel had arrived in North Africa 2 years earlier as a relatively unknown general sent to shore up the collapsing Italian position in Libya. What followed was the most brilliant period of his career, a series of campaigns that made him legendary throughout the world and earned him the nickname Desert Fox from both his admirers and his enemies. He had driven the British back to the gates of Egypt, threatened the Suez Canal, and proven that German forces could achieve the impossible through speed, aggression and operational brilliance. His Afrika Korps had become the elite of the German army veterans who worshipped their commander and believed he could work miracles. But by early 1943, the miracles had run out. Rommel had been defeated at El Alamein in October 1942, not through superior British tactics, but through overwhelming British superiority in men, tanks, aircraft and supplies. Montgomery had everything, while Rommel had nothing. The supply situation that had always plagued the Afrika Korps had become catastrophic. Italian ships carrying fuel, ammunition and reinforcements were being sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines faster than they could be replaced. Rommel's tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel. His troops were hungry, his hospitals were full, and the relentless British pursuit gave him no time to reorganize. He had retreated across Libya and into Tunisia, fighting delaying actions all the way, watching his once magnificent army wither through attrition it couldn't replace. Then the Americans had arrived. In November 1942, while Rommel was retreating from El Alamein, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, opening a second front in North Africa. The strategic situation had instantly become untenable. Rommel now faced enemies on 2 fronts, with supply lines that barely functioned and reinforcements that arrived in trickles. The German High Command had poured troops into Tunisia to hold a bridgehead, but these were second-rate formations, not the veterans of the Afrika Korps. The Italians were collapsing their army, dissolving as soldiers deserted or surrendered en masse. North Africa was clearly lost. The only question was how much damage Rommel could inflict before the inevitable end. And there was the key to understanding Rommel's thinking in mid-February. He knew he was finished strategically. He knew North Africa would be abandoned. He knew his career, his reputation, and possibly his life would soon be over. But he was still Erwin Rommel, and he still had veteran German troops who would follow him anywhere. If this was the end, he would go out attacking, not cowering in defensive positions, waiting to be overwhelmed. More practically, he could see that the American forces forming up in western Tunisia were vulnerable. They were untested troops with untested commanders, learning warfare for the first time against the most experienced desert fighters in the world. If he could smash them badly enough, he might delay the Allied offensive by months, buy time for the defense of Tunisia. and possibly even force the Allies to reconsider their entire North African strategy. The strategic landscape in Tunisia favoured Rommel's instincts. The country is divided by the eastern dorsal, a mountain range that runs roughly north-south through central Tunisia. The Americans had advanced through Algeria and were now positioned along the western side of these mountains, holding a line that stretched for over 100 miles with inadequate forces. The key passes through the eastern dorsal Field Kasserine Pass, were the gates between western and eastern Tunisia. If Rommel could break through these passes, he would emerge into the American rear areas, where their supply dumps headquarters and lines of communication were located. American forces were scattered, poorly coordinated, and led by commanders who thought in terms of textbook maneuvers, rather than the fluid, violent warfare Rommel had perfected. Rommel's plan evolved over several days of discussion, argument, and compromise with the Italian High Command and the other German commanders in Tunisia. The original concept was breathtakingly ambitious: break through the American lines at multiple points, drive west to the coastal town of Tebessa, where major American supply bases were located, then wheel north and trap the entire Allied position in northern Tunisia in a pocket that could be systematically destroyed. It was the kind of operation Rommel had executed brilliantly in 1941 and 42, when he had everything he needed. In February 1943, with limited fuel, exhausted troops, and only partial control over the forces in Tunisia, it was probably impossible. But Rommel believed that the American inexperience and the confusion caused by a sudden violent offensive might create opportunities that careful planning couldn't predict. The initial attacks would go through Field Pass on February the 14th, conducted by the 21st Panzer Division, one of the Afrika Korps' veteran formations. This would be a demonstration of classic German armoured tactics against troops who had never experienced them. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: draw American armour forward into what appeared to be a meeting engagement, then trap it between German forces attacking from multiple directions, using terrain that the Americans didn't properly understand. Rommel knew his tanks were technically inferior to the American Shermans and the British Grants the Americans were using, but he knew that tactics, experience, and combined arms coordination could overcome technical disadvantages. The attack through Field Pass on Valentine's Day 1943 was a textbook demonstration of everything Rommel had learned about armoured warfare in 2 years of desert combat. German tanks advanced through the pass in what appeared to be a straightforward attack, engaging American forces that had been positioned to defend the pass. The Americans responded exactly as Rommel expected, with their armour moving forward to meet the threat. What the Americans didn't know was that German forces had infiltrated through other positions during the night and were now positioned on the heights flanking the pass with anti-tank guns and more armour waiting to spring the trap. As American tanks advanced, they were suddenly taken under fire from unexpected directions by the lethal German 88mm guns that could destroy Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The American units at Field elements of the 1st Armoured Division fought with courage, but were simply outclassed. They were meeting the Afrika Korps for the first time and discovering that everything they had been told about German armoured tactics was both true and worse than they had imagined. German forces didn't just attack. They orchestrated complex movements that drew enemies into killing zones where superior German gunnery and positioning could achieve decisive results. The Americans found themselves fighting in 3 dimensions against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Their armour was picked off by anti-tank guns on the heights. Their infantry was pinned down by mortar fire. Their artillery, positioned too far back to provide effective support, was unable to influence the battle. By the end of the day, 2 American battalions had been effectively destroyed with hundreds of casualties and prisoners and substantial equipment lost. Field Pass was in German hands. For Rommel, the victory at Field was confirmation that his assessment of American forces was correct. They were brave, but inexperienced, aggressive, but poorly coordinated, equipped with good weapons, but lacking the tactical sophistication to use them effectively. The reports flowing back to his headquarters described American units breaking and retreating under pressure, abandoning positions and equipment, This was exactly what he needed to see. If American forces could be shattered at Faid, they could be shattered across the entire front. The question now was whether he could exploit this success before the Americans recovered and before the British arrived to stabilize the situation. The next phase of Rommel's offensive targeted Kasserine Pass itself, the most important gap in the eastern dorsal. While Faid had been a raid by a single armoured division, Kasserine would be a major offensive, involving multiple German and Italian divisions driving through the mountains toward the American rear areas. The pass was defended by American infantry and artillery, but Rommel believed that after the shock of Faid, a determined assault supported by armour could break through relatively quickly. Once through Kasserine, German forces would be positioned to drive northwest toward Tebessa or northeast toward Thala, both critical American positions. The confusion and panic that a breakthrough would cause might collapse the entire American defensive line, but executing this operation required coordination between Rommel's Afrika Korps veterans and other German forces in Tunisia under different command structures. This was where the plan began to unravel, not through American resistance, but through German command dysfunction. Rommel technically didn't have authority over all German forces in Tunisia. That belonged to Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army and who had his own ideas about how operations should be conducted. Von Arnim was a capable officer, but a careful, methodical one, who believed in following proper procedures and maintaining clear command structures. Rommel was an improviser who believed in seizing opportunities and worrying about command arrangements later. The two men despised each other, and the Italian High Command, which theoretically coordinated both of them, lacked the authority to force cooperation. This meant that as Rommel's offensive developed, it did so without the full weight of German forces in Tunisia behind it. Von Arnim released some units for Rommel's operation, but held back others for his own planned attacks. The Italian command dithered, issuing contradictory orders and failing to provide clear direction. Rommel found himself launching the most important offensive of the Tunisian campaign, with partial resources, unclear objectives, and command arrangements that guaranteed confusion. It was the kind of organizational nightmare that would have doomed most operations before they started. That it succeeded anyway was testament to both Rommel's operational skill and American unpreparedness. The assault on Kasserine Pass began on February the 19th, with German and Italian forces attacking American positions in and around the pass from multiple directions. The defenders were a mix of American infantry artillery and engineers who had been rushed forward to hold the position after the disaster at Faid. They were dug in on the heights overlooking the pass and in the pass itself determined to hold against what they expected to be another probing attack. What they got instead was a coordinated assault by veteran German armour and infantry supported by overwhelming artillery and Luftwaffe strikes. The Germans attacked with a level of violence and coordination that shocked the American defenders. This wasn't the cautious, methodical warfare they had trained for. This was the blitzkrieg brought to North Africa and perfected through 2 years of desert combat. The American defenders at Kasserine fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed by an enemy operating at a tempo they couldn't match. German tanks and infantry worked together seamlessly with armour providing mobile firepower, while infantry cleared defensive positions and engineers dealt with minefields. German artillery preparation was precise and devastating, targeting American positions with accuracy that suggested excellent reconnaissance and intelligence. The Luftwaffe, which had largely disappeared from North African skies due to Allied air superiority, reappeared in strength over Kasserine, bombing and strafing American positions, and demonstrating that German air power, when concentrated, could still influence a battle. By February 20th, American forces were being driven back through Kasserine Pass itself. The defensive positions that were supposed to hold for days were being overrun in hours. American units found themselves retreating under fire, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion as the German pressure intensified. The scenes were chaotic and demoralizing. American soldiers who had never experienced defeat suddenly found themselves part of a rout. Officers who had confidently led their units forward days earlier were now trying to organize retreats under fire. Equipment that had been carefully positioned was abandoned as units fell back. The pass that was supposed to be the anchor of the American defensive line was lost. For Rommel, watching reports come in from the front, this was the moment of decision. His forces had broken through at Kasserine. The road to Tebessa or Thala was open. American forces were in retreat, potentially in collapse. This was the opportunity he had been seeking, the chance to turn a tactical success into an operational breakthrough that could change the entire campaign. The question was whether he had the resources to exploit it, and whether the American collapse was real or just a temporary panic that would be stabilized once American commanders recovered their balance. Rommel, aggressive by instinct, decided to push forward. He ordered his armoured forces to exploit through Kasserine toward Thala, believing that one more blow might shatter American resistance completely. The exploitation toward Thala demonstrated both Rommel's genius and the limitations he was operating under. German armour moved through Kasserine Pass and into the American rear areas, advancing against scattered resistance and creating exactly the kind of chaos Rommel had hoped for. American commanders didn't know where German forces were, how strong they were, or where they were heading. Communication broke down as units retreated, lost contact, or were simply overrun. The carefully planned American defensive positions were being bypassed or attacked from unexpected directions. It was the kind of operational confusion that Rommel had exploited so effectively in earlier campaigns. But the advance was slower than it needed to be because Rommel didn't have the fuel, the forces, or the freedom of action to press the exploitation as aggressively as the situation demanded. His tanks kept stopping to refuel from captured American dumps, which provided fuel but cost time. His infantry couldn't keep up with the armour because they lacked sufficient transport. The Italian forces involved in the offensive were proving unreliable, with entire units simply stopping or retreating without orders when faced with determined American resistance. And most critically, American artillery and the American Air Force were beginning to recover from the initial shock and were now hitting German columns with increasing effectiveness. By February 21st, as German forces approached Thala and other American positions, they were running into stiffer resistance from units that had been rushed forward to stop the breakthrough. American commanders, reeling from the initial disaster, were beginning to stabilize the situation through exactly the kind of massive material advantage that Rommel knew would ultimately defeat him. Artillery battalions that had been positioned in depth were now being concentrated to create defensive firepower that German forces couldn't overcome. American tank destroyer units armed with weapons that could kill German tanks were being positioned in ambush positions along likely German routes, and British units from Montgomery's army were being rushed westward to reinforce the American line before Rommel could break through completely. The climax of the offensive came at Thala and at Field Pass, where German forces launched desperate attacks against American and British positions that had been reinforced just in time. At Thala, German armour crashed into defensive lines held by American infantry and British artillery that had been rushed forward during the night. The fighting was intense, with German tanks penetrating into the town itself before being stopped by concentrated artillery fire and determined infantry resistance. At Field, German attempts to widen the breakthrough were stopped by American forces that had finally gotten their footing and were fighting with the kind of cohesion they should have shown from the beginning. The exploitations that should have broken through to the American rear areas and supply bases stalled in front of hastily organized defensive lines. Rommel could see that the opportunity was closing. His forces were exhausted, his fuel was nearly gone, and the American defenses were strengthening by the hour. British reinforcements were arriving in strength. The air attacks on his supply lines were intensifying. The Italian command was already talking about withdrawing rather than reinforcing success. Most critically, Rommel's tactical instincts told him that the Americans were learning fast. The confused, panicked troops of February 19th were already showing signs of the competence they would display later in the war. Give them a few more days, and they would be dangerous. Give them a few more weeks, and they would be formidable. On February the 22nd, Rommel made the decision to withdraw. It was one of the hardest decisions of his career, calling off an offensive that had achieved more than anyone had expected, that had broken through American lines and sent an entire army reeling backward, but that had ultimately failed to achieve decisive results. His forces pulled back through Kasserine Pass, taking their wounded and as much captured equipment as they could carry, leaving behind destroyed American vehicles and the bodies of soldiers from both sides who had died fighting for a pass in the Tunisian mountains. By February 23rd, the Battle of Kasserine Pass was over. American forces reoccupied the pass. The defensive line was restored. The crisis had passed. For Rommel, Kasserine Pass represented both triumph and tragedy. From a tactical perspective, it had been a brilliant operation. His forces had broken through, prepared defenses, defeated American units in detail, captured over 6,000 prisoners, destroyed or captured hundreds of tanks and vehicles, and demonstrated that German armoured tactics remained superior to anything the Allies could field. He had inflicted a stinging defeat on American forces in their first major engagement with the Wehrmacht, a defeat that sent shockwaves through Allied command and forced a complete reorganization of American forces in North Africa. It was exactly the kind of victory that had made Rommel legendary, but strategically, it had accomplished nothing. The Americans had not been driven out of Tunisia. The British advance from the east had not been delayed significantly. The Allied timetable for closing the vice on Axis forces had been disrupted but not derailed. The supply situation that made German defeat inevitable had not changed. All Rommel had done was buy a few weeks and prove that even in defeat, the Afrika Korps could still hurt its enemies. It was a Pyrrhic victory at best, a last gasp of brilliance before the inevitable end. The aftermath of Kasserine revealed how little had really changed. The Americans replaced their ineffective commanders, reorganized their forces, and absorbed the lessons of defeat with remarkable speed. Within weeks, the same units that had been routed at Kasserine were fighting with competence and confidence. The British continued their advance from the east, now coordinating closely with American forces to prevent any more German surprises. And Rommel himself, sick, exhausted, and increasingly at odds with the German High Command, was recalled to Europe in early March. He would never return to North Africa. The army he had led to such remarkable victories would surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. Its remnants going into prisoner-of-war camps while Rommel watched from Germany. But for those 5 days in February 1943, Erwin Rommel had shown one last time why he was considered one of history's great battlefield commanders. Outnumbered, undersupplied, trapped between two armies with his back against the sea, and no hope of strategic success, he had nonetheless looked at his maps and seen opportunity where others saw only defeat. He had launched an offensive that shouldn't have worked and made it work through tactical brilliance, operational daring, and an intuitive understanding of how to exploit enemy weakness. He had broken an American army, sent it reeling backward in defeat, and reminded the world that the Desert Fox still had teeth. Kasserine Pass was Rommel's last victory, his final moment of genius before the weight of Allied material superiority crushed everything he had built in North Africa. It was a battle that showed what he could do with limited resources against green troops. And it was a battle that showed the limits of what even genius could accomplish against enemies who could afford to lose battles, learn from them, and come back stronger. The Americans would remember Kasserine as their first defeat, their baptism of fire that taught them how hard modern warfare would be. Rommel would remember it as his last triumph, the final time his vision and daring had produced victory against impossible odds before the desert he had dominated for 2 years became his grave. The pass itself, those few miles of mountain road in central Tunisia, remains a small geographic feature in a landscape that has seen many battles. But for a few days in February 1943, it was the centre of Erwin Rommel's world, the place where he proved one last time that skill and audacity could still matter even when strategy and logistics said the war was already lost. It was the place where the Desert Fox showed his teeth for the last time, where he broke an American army and reminded everyone why his name would be remembered long after the battles he fought were forgotten by all but historians. It was Rommel's last victory, and it was brilliant, futile, and unforgettable.